Should fans have more control over the films and projects they watch and consume? That's what everyone's talking about at the moment. Ever since an article from Variety broke the news that some studios are running kind of next-generation focus groups to consult about how pictures are marketed and even how they're made, in the wake of recent industry-wide issues with fan toxicity. Or, anti-fan toxicity, but they call it toxic fandom. This has also given rise to an internet-wide bout of discourse about how far letting fans cook is a good idea. Now, as you might be able to tell from my voice, I haven't been super well recently, and I'm away from home for a bit this month, so thanks to the bad timing on the part of my immune system, the stuff I was going to put out this month has kind of not come together in time, but I did want you guys to have something to watch this October, so what I've done here is edited in a kind of chopped down version of a discussion I had with TSD Talks and Pentex Productions on a recent episode of my podcast, which kind of serendipitously covers broadly this ground, and I've also reeled off some thoughts more specifically about the Variety situation and the subsequent discourse after that, so bit of a different video today. And if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, hey, no obligation to stick around, put your phone down, go and do some laundry or something. I know you've got laundry to do, I can see it piling up. I know you said you'd get to it, but come on, it's been days. You're not getting to it. You're not gonna have anything clean to wear. Anyway, here's the podcast clip.
You're granted complete IP control of one character/group of characters and a sizable budget to make a TV or film show based on them. Who do you pick, and what are you making?
I don't know. Do either of you have an answer for this off the bat that you can give while the other two of us think?
Off the bat for me would be James Bond. That's probably quite an obvious answer for me. But it's also, it's a double-edged sword because, I obviously have a load of pie-in-the-sky dreams of what I'd like to do with the character and what my perfect Bond film would look like. But as a fan, I think if you're involved in the creative side, all of a sudden, I don't know, can you continue to enjoy that series? And also, what if there is, what if you put your heart and soul into a character and then the fan base that you are a part of disagrees with that for whatever reason, and then all of a sudden you're hated and everyone thinks you hate this character.
Whoa, are you?
Like, no,
is your name Ryan Johnson? What?
No, that's interesting though, because even just making videos on something, if you go deep enough into the analysis and research of a piece of media you love, there is a point where you kind of have to unplug from the matrix and you can never quite come back to that thing the exact same way, I think. I know that with some of the stuff I've done the longest video essays about, or some of the stuff I wrote about for my literature course in uni and stuff, when you put that amount of thought into something, you can never enjoy it quite as sort of naively as you once could.
Yeah.
And I guess that is scaled up a lot if you're on the other side of the glass,
I think that the question of whether or not fans should take charge of their stories is a very, very complicated one.
Hire fans! Yeah.
Because
the r/Star Wars Reddit cry.
Yeah. Because the thing about that is that there's so many storylines where you see fans complain about and they say, oh, these writers don't care about the story. And I feel that's not always a bad thing, because I feel if someone doesn't have an emotional...
you don't want to be so in the source that you kind of can't make the moves that need to be made because you're too attached to all the kind of minutiae.
Going to Star Wars, you think about what's off the top of your head, what's the best thing that Star Wars has put out in the last 5 years?
It's not something by Filoni is where I think you're going with this.
It's
exactly. Tony Gilroy was he was intrigued by the possibilities, but he was not a Star Wars fan, right? Was he before that?
Not really, no. He was just kind of a guy. He was a writer who was hired onto it. It's okay.
He's a good TV writer.
And then you hear
not a super fan.
You hear Dave Filoni talk about Star Wars, and he's Star Wars is basically his life, and I'm happy for him.
It so much.
I'm happy for him. He's got his dream.
Yeah.
But I also feel he's making Star Wars for himself, pretty much.
Yeah.
He's making it for other people who have also been lost in the sauce of Star Wars fandom culture forever. And that is kind of detrimental to trying to when you're trying to make a good story, because what you essentially I talked about this in my Star Wars video. I said that part of the issue is that what you're doing is relying on people's preconceived knowledge of these characters to do as a substitute for actually writing compelling characters, because you're oh, that's Boba Fett, he was blah 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 in this thing. Oh, that's Ahsoka, she had this great character arc in this other show, so obviously she's a good character if I just plop her in here.
Yeah, no, that is true. It's a bit simplistic to put Filoni in this same category, but like when you go on the internet and you see someone saying, "Oh, the writers don't care, hire me, I'm a fan," and then you see in another post, "Hey, this is my pitch for property X," whatever it is. Without exception, their pitch is always dog shit.
Yeah, it's like
I remember seeing something that, and it was in the Star Wars fandom. I can't remember where I saw this, but some people were like complaining about whatever the latest show was, and one of them was like, "When are we gonna get like a really good Anakin Skywalker series?" And I was like, the prequel trilogy? Like famously the main character of it's just like, and you can tell in their head they were like, we want like Anakin Skywalker running around like killing people and stuff, and you're like, you got Anakin Skywalker's story pretty good. You got 3 movies, and
you got 3
TV shows.
You got 3 movies, a couple TV shows, a bunch of comics. They just need to listen to the
fans, though. They just need to listen to the fans.
Yeah, I had a little bit of exposure to this because I re-edited Obi-Wan Kenobi into a movie, but that was kind of coming from the point of view where it wasn't like, oh, the show wasn't made for the fans. It was just like, this show is not very good at telling the story it's trying to tell, and this is very obviously a screenplay for a 2-hour movie that has had an extra 3 hours worth of material foisted onto it, and it's like, if you cut all of that away, you would actually end up with a good story. I made the edit, and it turned out to be right, I think. I think the movie tells the same story in a much better way, but it's like, that's just bad storytelling. That's not because the creators weren't fans or
and like set like
that.
an r/Star Wars guy whose like biggest complaint is the fact that the Grand Inquisitor's head is the wrong shape or whatever the fuck it was. Let them loose in the editing system. I guarantee you their edit is not going to be as good as yours.
Yeah, I hate to keep bringing it to the ground.
And that's the sort of thing that does drive you insane, where people's biggest issue with a show is the guy's head looks wrong or whatever, and you're like, that can be symptomatic of a wider issue in the story, but like, the show is bad. The reason the show's bad isn't because he doesn't look like how he looks in the animated show. It's like the show is bad because the writing and pacing is terrible. Anyway, you're talking about Gravity Falls.
Yeah, I hate to keep bringing it back to it, but I feel like the creators for that show had the perfect mindset with it. I was listening to an interview where he was talking about, essentially he was being asked a question of like, there's this tie-in comic that you wrote for the show that's like made reference to this one thing that happened, and it could be seen as addressing criticisms of a character in the show that the fan base has had for a long time. And would you say that was what you were trying to do? Like, why did you want to try to address this like loud minority of people? And essentially his response was like, I didn't have that in mind when I was writing it. He like talked about how like what the entire creative process for writing that story, and the main goal was like, the main point was just like, if this happens to like fall into some kind of fandom narrative, it was completely unintentional. Like me and the team, we're not focused. We don't have like characters that like we're rooting for in our writing rooms that we're trying to assassinate to each other. We just want to tell like an interesting story, and we have the characters at hand that we have, and we try to mix them together to try and do something interesting. Cause that's the thing about fandom, the way that you perceive characters through fandom and the way you perceive characters through writing, is that when you're perceiving them through fandom, you see them as like fully fledged human beings who you can like hurt the feelings of, and you can like, baby girl of fire, whatever, and you can like think like, oh, that's like that's kind of they're like static characters that exist as that almost as real people. But when you're in the writer's room, they're more like tools for moving the storyline. They're like a bundle of
attributes,
they're a series of factors and puzzle pieces that you can put together in new and interesting ways to tell cool stories. And I feel like the biggest issue with most like fan pitches for stuff is that they treat these characters like static, action figures.
Yeah, they give them too much respect.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I was always pissed off with the The Last Jedi doesn't respect Luke Skywalker. Last Jedi has a lot of problems. The fact that it doesn't treat Luke Skywalker like a god is not at all one of them. Like, that's one of its biggest
Yeah,
strengths.
and it's the best argument for the fact that it does respect Luke Skywalker to the degree that a character should be respected. You know, it takes him seriously and it doesn't fucking wash his feet. I don't know.
So that was the podcast clip, but I do have a few more thoughts and comments I wanted to stick on the end, also unscripted, just tying that into the Variety article, the stuff it's talking about, and the kind of should fans have more say discourse that it's given rise to. So I was obviously a little bit negative in that clip about the idea of, you know, fans having more control. And widely, I do still think that, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. But one caveat, I do think it wouldn't hurt at all to have these groups to kind of communicate to writers or directors or execs, whoever, what the appeal of the material they're working with is. Because, you know, as we all know, it definitely has happened that someone lands a job with an adaptation and they don't quite get why people like the thing they're working with. And obviously, you don't always have to make an adaptation that follows the spirit of the original. Totally not. It's fine if you want to use existing pieces to craft your own vision of something. Go for it, you know? But it probably couldn't hurt to at least have the full picture of why people like the thing you're using. If there were groups like this playing a solely informative role, I wouldn't have an issue with that, but as the article makes clear, that isn't the extent of how these systems seem to be working at the moment. And also, moving from the discourse to the article itself, I also think there's maybe some value in groups of maybe more online fans who are more dialed into the toxic fandom thing, informing the people in marketing or wherever what is maybe going to set those toxic corners of the internet off. But also, in the failures and backlashes this is all in response to, none of this was really caused by that, right? As Amanda Stenberg says, as the article itself, is aware of, backlash to the Acolyte started well before the trailer. And even talking about the trailer, the things that got spun out by the usual suspects into toxicity from the trailer, they're not about the ways the narrative's being sort of teased or presented. It's about race and gender, guys. It doesn't matter how many well-meaning fans you have telling you what's going to set these people off. You don't get rid of that from the Acolyte or its trailer by recutting a softer version of it. Unless the whole trailer's just going to focus on Daphne Keane, there's going to be racists. We saw that. That's what happened. Going back to the discourse, another thing I've seen a little bit of is people being in favor of fans being given more agency in this way, by framing it as kind of a blow against the kind of genius auteur myth that art is created by one person and that this kind of democratizes the process. And yeah, I mean, like, great man theory, but art is silly, and the idea of democratizing Hollywood isn't the reason this idea is bad, but that not being the reason doesn't make it a good idea either. It's true that movies don't spring fully formed from, the thigh of Zeus, from one director's head. There's always more people involved, and sometimes they don't get the credit they should, but it's also true that a lot of the best movies are as good as they are because there's a sort of coherent vision to them. And I think maintaining that probably does get harder if you're looping more and more groups in, especially groups which don't necessarily have the same experience shaping stories in that medium. Especially if you're just looping them in after the fact as focus groups to weigh in on something that's already been written or shot. If there is a version of letting fans cook in this way that produces good results, I don't know, there might be. It would have to start far earlier in the process than that. But it's also just, too many cooks in a broader sense, right? Like, we can look at something like the Marvels, which is obviously another, failure in financial terms that some of these changes are probably in response to, and it was obviously troll farmed in the way the article goes on to talk about. But what flaws that had were in the way the film was chopped up and, noted to death by execs. And you can see this in the film by looking at the pacing of it, particularly the third act, and the way the sun reignition sequence is kind of toned down from what should be this whole emotional thematic kind of climax point to just a kind of 20-second sequence as we're wrapping things up. I think where the discourse around that film landed was that it probably would have been better if there had been less meddling with Nia DaCosta. There's no part of that film that's made worse by having more people not looped in, the opposite in fact. And I do think in a broader sense, these focus groups could potentially just be more studio interference in disguise, because there's always going to be selection bias at every point of this, right? Both in terms of which fans get picked for the groups and which ideas they suggest in terms of the marketing or in terms of changing the project actually get picked up and forwarded by the powers that be. And the elephant in the room that I haven't mentioned yet is the way that, give the fans what they want so often serves as a dog whistle for the very kind of bigoted nonsense that, in this case, these schemes seem to be positioned against. And that might be the case for the moment, but let's not forget we have seen plenty of executives, Bob Iger himself did some of this, walking back commitments to diversity, trying to scapegoat these things for failures in marketing or industry-wide problems they themselves contributed to. Think about the strikes, the way The Message got more blame from Iger than those did in the Marvel's underperformance. Basically what I'm getting at here is that any discussion of studios elevating the voices of the fans needs to consider the fact that there are a lot of people in the studios and a lot of people in the quote fan spaces who would be just thrilled to use these mechanisms to further that scapegoating. With regard to the wider discourse, letting fans write and democratizing Hollywood that way, that isn't how you democratize movies. You do that by reforming the industry, removing privilege or class or connections-based barriers to entry. And that isn't what this is. They don't want to do that here. This is a knee-jerk, reactive, symptomatic response, a band-aid fix. The answer here isn't artificially giving fans more privileges, it's by widening who can become a writer and how. I am completely not against fans being involved, but I don't think they should be involved as fans. I think they should be involved as writers or directors or consultants or whatever else. Like, I'd love to see someone like Nando V Movies have an impact, but not as someone flown in from the Fandom focus squad. No, as someone hired to write or rewrite a script because he's good at that. Not as Nando V Movies the YouTuber, but as Nando the writer. With regard to the Variety article and the specific problems it sets out regarding toxic fandom, this isn't the answer either. Again, there is a benefit in making the people behind the camera aware of what's going on, and if a program like this is run by people who accurately understand the state of toxic anti-fandom, how and why they respond to certain things, yes, this could help, but ultimately, as I've said time and time again, the kind of backlash the article's in response to isn't about the work. It isn't about its advertising. Woke spotting is a supremely malleable practice. Trying to not add more fuel to the fire, trying not to feed the trolls won't make them happy. They're not fans. They're anti-fans. They don't want to be happy. They're not there to be pleased. Short of making every project star white men and white men alone and do nothing but uphold normative, waspy social ideals, you can't meet their demands. The goalposts will always change. Trying to placate them, trying not to feed them, it's not gonna choke them out. The only thing that will is platform change. If the studios want to fix this, they need to go to YouTube. They need to tell them, we're going to re-examine our relationship. We're not going to allow our trailers or footage to be on your website anymore unless you start enforcing your terms of service and stop paying people for hatred. If they were serious about this, that's what they'd be doing. They are not doing that. It may be that they do really want to do something about toxic fandom, but at the moment, they're only trying to do something about it on their terms, and you can't slap a band-aid on a systemic problem. But yeah, that's my take on this whole thing, and this is probably the only public Pillar of Garbage video coming out this month. Might be one at the very end of October, if not it'll be the start of November. But if that's going to give you Pillar of Garbage withdrawals, I recently put out a Patreon YouTube member exclusive on Uglies. There's going to be another one of those in October for sure, about like games and philosophy and stuff. And I'm also contributing a miniature essay to the Essay Library's latest collaborative video. So thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my Patreons and supporters on screen now, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Magath, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy, and I'll see you soon. Well, you know, soonish.